All right, welcome listeners. We are so glad you're here because today we're diving in on a foundational conversation with Josh Goldberg, CEO of Boulder Crest Foundation, and Dr. Richard Tedeschi, Executive Director of the Boulder Crest Institute for Posttraumatic Growth. And we're diving in on a subject that's going to drive this entire series, and that is the science of post-traumatic growth. And we want to recognize that some people are listening to this for the first time. That might be the first time they've ever heard that term. They might not know what it means. And that's why we're here today. And so I feel like that's probably a good place to start is what is post-traumatic growth? And maybe that's a big question to lead with, but I feel like it's important for this one.
Well, Britt, thank you for getting us started. And so to do that, I'll make a definition that we use, and that is it's the positive changes that people often report in the struggle that they are involved in the aftermath of traumatic events. So we'll need to talk some about the other parts of that definition, what the struggle is and what we mean by traumatic events.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good place to start. You've told us a little bit before about how we define trauma, but what does that mean to start there?
Well, we define trauma a little differently than you might find in sort of the general psychological literature and general discussion in public. So it's a really specific thing where we talk about trauma as something that changes how people understand themselves and the world around them and their lives going forward. It's a challenge to what they've always thought was going to be in terms of who they are and where their life is going. So it's any kind of event that does that calls all that into question. That's what I mean by trauma. So it's not a particular sort of thing that somebody on the outside might think is bad enough or a particular thing. It's really what it does to how people are thinking.
How is that different from struggle?
Well, that's what people end up struggling with. So the trauma disrupts what they've always thought about their lives and what's happening to them and what kind of world they live in. And the struggle is, what am I going to think now? I have to reconstruct that whole system so that I have some way of operating the world that makes sense to me. So the struggle is trying to reconstruct that and figure out, what do I believe now?
I once heard somebody told me that only you can determine what's traumatic for you. Do you think that's true? Or do you think that's too blanket of a statement?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. We can't necessarily list certain kinds of events as traumatic and those that aren't. Because I've learned over the years that it's easy to make these kinds of assumptions about somebody else's life, but you don't really know the impact of these things on them until you really have a discussion and really have a conversation and learn, how any particular episode in their life or series of things that have happened to them have challenged them in these ways that we're talking about.
So if someone hears that phrase, growth after trauma, which I think can sound a little intimidating probably, or maybe that's not the first thought that you have is, oh, I've gone through something really hard and can't wait to see how I grow from this, right? But what do you think people should take away from that statement, growth after trauma, that there can be?
Well, that's why we talk about it as a struggle, because it's not easy. It sounds simple the way you put it, but it's not simple. And it can take months or years for people to get far enough along in the process after traumatic events for them to even see that there's growth there. So, and that's very individual. I mean, it varies a lot. So, well, we talk about a struggle because to rethink what you've always believed about yourself and your life and this world, sometimes that takes you in some pretty dark places.
Yeah. And Josh, how about from your side? I think one of the things that you do really well is connect the dots for people with pop culture, books, movies, really giving examples of kind of what that growth after trauma can look like and whether that's a real world scenario or something that's kind of fictionalized for us. Can you give like some examples of that or maybe where we see it that if someone isn't seeing it in their own life or somebody that they love, that maybe they've seen it illustrated in another way and they just didn't realize?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that I find really interesting is, my background before I came to Boulder Crest was working in communications. And as I spent a lot of time with veterans and you listen to their stories and you hear their stories and it's like, how did we get this narrative so upside down? And what I mean by that is we've gotten to this world where when someone's struggling, we tend to pathologize the struggle or the causes of the struggle. And it sort of short circuits the whole process, because now it's like, I have this diagnosis, this bad thing happened, I have this diagnosis. And then it's like, and now my job is essentially to live governed by this diagnosis. And the truth is, as someone who loves reading books, who loves, watching movies and stories, is every great story that we admire, whether that's C.S. Lewis, whether it's Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work, whether it's Harry Potter, Star Wars, or anything else we watch, is the story of somebody who goes through something that's earth-shattering. Because a movie where nothing happens isn't particularly interesting. And a movie where someone goes through something bad, and then the second part of the movie just is how crappy their life is, isn't particularly interesting or meaningful. And so what I find so interesting about the idea that many people haven't heard of post-traumatic growth is that it's literally the story of all great stories. And, you can even look in literature, you can look in religion, and in Romans it says, we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, hope. Every religion is rooted in these stories of suffering. So for Christians, it's Jesus on the cross suffering for the sins of others. For Jews, it's about slavery in Egypt and other suffering we've experienced that produce some gains, something valuable to us, some insight, some wisdom. So what I find interesting about what Rich and Lawrence did was they gave a name for something that is really recalibrating and almost reminding people of what we already knew to be true as human beings, but we lose sight of it, I think, when we medicalize the whole journey and process.
Yeah, and that's probably something we can look back on too, is that work that you were doing with your colleague, Dr. Calhoun, and just how post-traumatic growth came to be this term, what you guys were looking at, because it started in sort of an unlikely, or I guess with an unlikely question, that maybe people wouldn't make that one-to-one connection, which you weren't asking how do people grow after trauma, you were asking what makes someone wise. Is
That's
that
right.
correct? Yeah.
That's kind of where we started. You mentioned Dr. Calhoun. That's Lawrence Calhoun, who's a good friend of mine that I've worked with through all these years. And we were faculty members together at University of North Carolina at Charlotte for many years. And we had begun to do a little bit of work together, a little research together. And we came together one time and we're examining the whole idea of why we were psychologists and what we really want to know about, what was really interesting to us. And we decided that it was kind of that wisdom, it was like, how do people get wise? I mean, where's it come from? What's, what's the pathway to wisdom? And we had this inkling already then that the pathway to wisdom was through difficulties in life because of what Josh is talking about, because there's all these stories that we're familiar with in our culture and other cultures. So they kind of indicate to us that there's something about traveling through these difficulties that enlightens people. So we started with that, but given in the psychological literature, there wasn't a lot of research on that. We figured, okay, we want to shed light on that from a more psychological or scientific perspective and understand that. So that's where we started.
And I love, so you had that inclination, and then you went out and you started to talk to people, right?
Well, no, not really.
Oh boy, this is
We started to listen to people.
Mm.
That's a big difference.
I like it.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. So we just started to sit down with people who had been through very difficult things and listen to their stories and ask them questions, kind of like what we're doing here, right? And had them describe to us what they'd been through. And they told us this kind of story that you mentioned, Josh. We heard those kinds of stories from these people who had been suffering physical disabilities in adulthood. They'd been traveling along life, doing pretty well, and then wham, something just derailed their life in a terrible way. But we also had found, we were looking in our community for people who managed it well, who were the stars of rehabilitation. In fact, there are a couple of people we interviewed who were Paralympic athletes, which seems like, the sort of the ultimate, reconfiguration of one's life after something horrible disabling you. So we listened to these stories and gleaned a lot. They sent us in the direction that we've, been going through all these years in this work.
And you also did a lot of work too, and a big part of your career was with bereaved parents, correct?
Right. It was shortly after that start with that research I was just describing, that I got involved with a nonprofit organization that served bereaved parents. And I worked with them for 25 years doing support groups for these parents whose children had died. And again, it was listening, because I wasn't even a parent. I wasn't even married at that time. We got started on that. So I I didn't feel like I knew anything, and I didn't have the right to say anything or to instruct in any way or advise. So I listened and just helped them, figure out their journey and their pathway, and again, learned a lot by listening to those stories and how people were getting through such a horrible event in their lives.
And Rich, I'm curious, having known you for at this point 12 years, is you've never lost that, I guess I'd call it like beginner's mind of this sense of like, I don't know anything, so teach me about your life, teach me about what you're experiencing. Like, I guess, what do you think has allowed you to sustain that curiosity and the humility, I think, that underpins it as somebody who's, I think at this point pretty well known.
I just think it's more interesting to listen to other people and learn from them, because the stories are so amazing. So that's what I want to concentrate on. I want to listen and learn from the stories. So that's one thing. Um, Second thing I think is, I would be embarrassed to claim that I know how to do this well, because I mean, I've had some things happen in my life, but I don't feel like I have the right to talk about growth in the same way that I've seen other people go through it, because people have amazed me what they've gone through. So, sometimes I'm often sitting there saying, "Man, look at that. If I were in that situation, I don't know how I would do." So I don't wanna claim that I could, and then later on be embarrassed when it happens to me.
And one of the things I also find interesting is, and it comes back to the earlier question you had asked about kind of what is traumatic, is I think when we look at other people's lives, we imagine how we would have felt if we went through certain experiences. But recently I was with somebody who was paralyzed for a period of time and ended up kind of fighting their way back. But for most people, like that accident that caused that would be the thing, and it's like, no, that wasn't the thing, and it was this other thing. And I know you've had people who've had similar things, and I think that's one of the interesting parts is you have to listen in two ways. One is you have to listen to understand, not make assumptions about what you think is the thing that's causing them challenges. But the second part to listen to is it's not just about what happened; it's the impact of what happened. It's the point. It's the struggle. Is what are they struggling with in the aftermath of fill in the blank? That is really where the work and the exploration lies, right?
That's right, and so you can't make these assumptions and get very far, really, because it leads you into the ditch somewhere, and you're not really understanding it all. So just for example, just yesterday, I met for the first time this young woman who had been in a motor vehicle accident and is paralyzed. So she comes to my office in her wheelchair and all. I met her for the first time. And I realize I don't I don't know this story. I've heard this kind of story before, but I don't know her version of this. And we just scratched the surface,
Hmm.
because it's a very painful story for her. And and I all my job is to try to let her know that this is a safe place for her to talk about what's going on and what she's been through, so that I can learn the story enough to be some sort of companion with her through this process. But right now, I really am at a loss. I really don't know what this is all about, despite all these years of listening to stories.
hmm And I think that is something, there is a lot of human nature in that of, when we watch certain movies or we read certain books, and I keep focusing on the bereaved parents because I am a parent. And my husband and I always joke that now when those shows come on, we can't watch them when something happens or a kid dies. You're just like, you can't look at it. And I think I've seen so many comments like that on social media where somebody endures a tragic loss of a child and people say, how are you getting up every day? I could never survive that, which is, first of all, not helpful. But I think we just try to wrap our heads around, what do you do? And I think that's kind of one of my questions for you is, does growth after trauma mean you feel better? Is that the goal? Is it something deeper? So for people listening to that might be thinking, what's the end state that you're trying to achieve?
Well, first of all, there's no end state we're trying to achieve. It's not an achievement. It's just a way of living in the aftermath of whatever has happened that has shifted your life in a different direction, at least in terms of how you think about your life and yourself. So it may only be that. You still, on the surface, look like you're doing the same things, but it's from a different mindset. So it could be that. But it's not like there's a specific time frame where people feel better. It sort of comes on as a surprise because of how they've been working through this whole process. And at some point, they might say, kind of feeling all right. I was feeling horrible. I might have been suicidal. But now, I see some glimmers of hope, or I'm enjoying myself. So, for example, with bereaved parents, one common thing is when they start enjoying themselves and then bring themselves up short and say, how could I enjoy myself? My child's dead. Am I allowed to feel this way? Is this dishonoring my child? Should I feel guilty about this? So feeling better becomes another challenge, you say. So this whole thing of feeling better, it can be quite complicated. And it's not the goal. The whole idea here is we're trying to help people find a meaningful life in the aftermath of what has happened. And if you live meaningfully, you can feel better. It may not be a totally happy life, but it's one that makes sense now and is got a purpose to it. You have some kind of mission, and that pulls you forward into something that maybe is different than what you had experienced, and that may be better. That may be better than what you've been doing before. You say, I wouldn't have done this if I hadn't been going through this. So that might be better. So there's all kinds of betters in this that we talk about with post-traumatic growth. Those are the changes that we focus on, and we'll talk more about what they look like. So it's not just a feeling, but there's all these aspects of living and how you engage in your own life that you recognize are better in some ways.
And I think one of the things, and we work with a lot of the military veteran community, first responder community. There's a lot of survivor's guilt, and it's similar to what Rich talks about. There's this aspect of permission. It's like, and you think about socially, you lose your child. It's like you're not supposed to be. There's a certain social expectation, and I always think like, as a Jew, people mourn for a year. They wear black. They won't listen to music for the Orthodox. But then that's it, right? That like they have to. So there's these rituals we have that I think we've lost touch with, and one of the, I think, most remarkable messages we've ever gotten in 14 years was a woman in Belgium who had lost her son and husband in a car accident, and she was badly injured and her daughter was unscathed. And she was an academic. She was trying to make sense of like, what am I supposed to do with this? She was also a Christian, so she spoke to her faith. But she said that when she came across Rich's work, and it speaks so much to why I think I love Rich, because he's such a kind soul, is that when she came across the idea of post-traumatic growth, and she came across it in a way that felt so like kind and approachable and accessible and human, it gave her permission to realize that the path she was on, which was like trying to figure out, how do I live with this? How do I bring this into my life and story? But how do I continue to try to make sense of life and continue to live, because life will continue to go on. Her daughter is going to continue to grow up, and she can experience and enjoy that. But she needed this sense of permission that she wasn't walking a path that hadn't been walked before, and that there was also a name for this thing. Because in the absence of that, I think our mind tells us that like something bad happened, and at some level, we're supposed to stay in it. And then staying in it is also what keeps us connected to those we've lost. And I just don't think that is what any of the philosophers or the scriptures speak to. But I think our mind does a lot to weigh us down. And I think society also does the same.
The idea of putting a name to it can be important for people. Now, if you go to the doctor and you have all these symptoms and everything, and you can't figure out what's wrong with you, and the doctor says, well, that's that, and says it has a name. You say, oh, well, now somebody gets it or understands, or I'm not the only one or something like that. So this naming can be important in like diagnosis, for example. Sometimes I think when people stumble upon this term post-traumatic growth, it legitimizes what they're going through because they haven't been able to actually have a way of talking about it with other people that other people can make sense of, or um, it doesn't feel like it has a place in the kind of the trauma literature or the trauma understanding. So one of the things I'm happy about is that this term post-traumatic growth has allowed people like Josh is talking about to say, oh, okay, this thing I'm doing is for real. Other people understand it. Other people have talked about it or written about it. So therefore, it gives them more energy to engage it. Say, okay, now it's almost having permission in a way. Say, now this is for real and I can dig into it and go with it. So I think that's what just having this term can do for people, which I'm very, very happy about.
Yeah, and that you're in Dr. Calhoun's humility of not naming it after yourself. So that's 1,000% what I would.
I hadn't thought of that.
You should. Did you have some other? Why not post-traumatic healing? Did
That's
you go
right.
through iterations?
Should call it the Tedeschi effect.
Yeah, see, we missed it.
It's funny because I like to say that if Rich and Lawrence were more of an egomaniac, then many more people would know that post-traumatic growth exists than do, because that's just not their way. They're just kind, humble listeners of other human beings. And I think that it's an amazing thing. And I think Rich is 100% right. And we've seen it from people who we definitively know have grown, and some of our friends. And like when they start to look at all of it, it's like scaffolding and a framework for the other side of the story, that they're like, oh yeah, like I've experienced incredible growth in this deeper relationships. And now all of a sudden it tethers to like an actual framework that exists in the world. And I think it makes it less illusory, but also gives them permission to experience like, yeah, this is our journey as human beings.
Yeah, scaffolding is a good term for it. It allows people to climb into a life that's working better for them, but they have to have this way to get there, and this work that we're doing provides that.
I know we're going to dive a lot more into some of the specifics. That's what this entire series is about, so we won't have to cover all of that here. But I am curious how your colleagues and other peers reacted or maybe received the research and findings that you and Dr. Calhoun kind of uncovered.
It took a long time for us to even, we talk about the term and labeling, come up with the term. It took us about 10 years.
Really?
Yes. So
not marketers.
Yeah.
we were doing this research.
Ready in 2035.
We were doing this research, and we had published a few things and given some conference presentations, and we were talking about perceptions of change and things like this. And we were writing our first book on this, and the book had been essentially written. It was a publisher, pretty much a publisher and everything. And Lawrence and I were talking about, there must be some sort of term for this that's better than what we had found people talking about, because people have been saying, for example, positive byproducts. It's like, sounds like a rendering.
Like
So
it just hot dog.
Yeah, but people had been talking about this, but in terms that were just not very appealing. So he said we had to come up with some better. So that's what we came up with. But it was all this work for these years before we came up with this term, and it was a term that nobody had used before or heard of. So we had to introduce it to the literature. And frankly, it wasn't easy, because at that time, and this is still the truth, I think now to some extent, at that time, all the publishers were interested in publishing about post-traumatic stress disorder. So we would go to them with these ideas, and they'd say, well, we'd love to have you write a book about PTSD. And I said, people are doing that, and that's not what we're interested in. It's something else. Well, no, I don't. We never heard of that. That's the whole point. Well,
yeah.
So, but finally we did get published, and then since then we published a lot of books. But it was not easy going. And then the other part of the answer to your question is, a lot of people still just don't believe it exists, and they call it an illusion, or people are just in some form of denial, or there's a lot of academic literature that was written to say that this isn't really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to that anymore.
And the only thing I'd say on that, because I agree that it's not worth much of a mention, is I feel bad for anybody who believes that, because it means that if something really awful happens in their life, then they're screwed. And I think that, I know that and you've written about this idea that, people know that bad things happen to good people. They don't believe that it will happen to them. Otherwise we wouldn't function. But at the same time, you have to have some faith and belief that, and whatever you believe more broadly is that there's something to be taken from these things. And certainly I know way too many people who've lost their children to suicide. And if that was true, then essentially their life is done. Like call it, it's over.
Mm-hmm.
They're just in survival mode and just sort of passing time. And it just doesn't make sense. And some of my heroes, and you asked about literature, Viktor Frankl is one of my heroes. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist. He worked with suicidal women in Austria before he ended up in Auschwitz. He lost his wife. He lost his parents. He lost his brother. He lost his wife after liberation. She died of starvation or typhus post the liberation of the camps. And he talked about what he learned from his experience. And in some ways, I consider it like the predecessor of Rich's work, a book that's been read by millions of people. And, you see it in these most darkest of circumstances. Our friends, POWs at the Hanoi Hilton, it's like we see this over and over again. And you meet these folks, and there's like nothing illusory about their lives and the way they live their lives. And so I think it's powerful, but this is what, and when you're not hosting podcasts, right, a big part of what you get to do is you get to speak to people who've walked these paths.
Mm-hmm.
And putting those stories into the world is almost this way of rebalancing these narratives so that people realize, like, yes, and the other piece I really value about Rich's work and the way he speaks is it doesn't gloss over the really hard stuff, right? It's not like the woman comes into his office in a wheelchair, she went through this accident, it's like, okay, I get all this. This is terrible. But we're just going to talk about growth, right? It's just like, this is bad, but I do growth. That's what we do. We do this in this room. It's like, no, like we start with like, tell me about yourself. Like what's occurred in your life? And you have that conversation and you don't gloss over it, but you get to walk alongside somebody who more than anything realizes that they may feel like they're in a hole, but they ain't in the hole by themselves. And then, slowly but surely you start to venture out and seize opportunities to reflect on your perspective. And I think it's beautiful, beautiful work.
Yeah.
So Rich, if we could pivot for a second and ask you, what would you say are the biggest misconceptions about PTG? And if I just planted a couple seeds in there, positive psychology, resilience, like some of those, what would be the misconceptions that you would think about when you think about PTG?
Probably any word I've said to you so far.
Yeah. You'll get there.
Well,
yeah.
You too can grow. We have hope.
Yes.
We have hope, right?
Yes, that's right. That's what we're all doing. We're all doing that. Okay, so one that we've talked about a little bit is that it's a goal that you achieve instead of it being a consistent journey that you're on essentially throughout your life in the aftermath of these events. So we never finish this process of growing and developing as human beings. So that's one thing. Another misconception is that it's easy somehow, because the term post-traumatic growth sounds very positive. So this is something that, maybe happens easily when there's a struggle involved, actually. It's not easy. Another misconception is that people's lives are happy in the aftermath of this. And as you were just kind of mentioning, it's a mixed bag. It's not all happiness. There's still a lot of struggle. There's still loss. There's still things that you regret, and you wish that life were different, and all that can be going on. At the same time, you realize that there are valuable things that you have learned and that you're doing now. So it's kind of a mixture of these things. And therefore, you have to recognize the paradox of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's a paradoxical thing at its root, that out of loss can come gain. And then you stumble upon all kinds of paradoxical things like out of your grief because of whatever you've lost in your life as a result of whatever events it might be. Out of the grief can come more gratitude because you recognize that maybe you've overlooked simple things in your life that now you can value. So that's kind of a paradox, that you realize your vulnerability that you might not have paid too much attention to before, or realized before. Now you realize, yes, you're vulnerable, and terrible things can happen and have happened. But knowing something about life from this perspective makes you feel stronger. So there's this paradoxical element to it, all the bad stuff and all the good stuff all mixed up. So there's that. And then the resilience notion. This is where this concept of resilience, which is that we are able to resist the effects of difficult events in our life and go on despite these things, is mixed up with the idea of growth, which comes as a result of having had a great and negative impact of these events on us. Because that's what challenges all these ideas that we have and these cognitive maps that we have about how to understand life and how to live it. So resilience is different because it means we're cruising along pretty well despite something that is potentially traumatic, but we're dealing with it. We're doing fine. Growth, no, we don't deal with it fine. It takes us down, and it could take us down to where we feel like we're really at the bottom of things, and we have to reconstruct out of that. So it's a different trajectory. However, ultimately, maybe because of the growth that we experience, we do become better able to handle things in the future, stronger in certain ways, more resilient in certain ways. But it's after all of this that we're there. So that's kind of a misconception. So there's these kinds of things that are important to understand to really get a grasp on what this whole journey is like.
When you're talking to some, there's obviously all the stories and the people we've met and encountered along the way. And I just think about this Gold Star mom who lost her son in Afghanistan. And she was talking about the Kubler-Ross model in grief. And she said that, it was really important. As a book by someone named Kessler. There's an extra step. And that step was meaning. And it's like, what do I do with this? And what now? And I think, we had the Secretary of the VA come visit. He's a chaplain, and he sat with our Warrior Path students, and he said, you sit and you ask why, and you ask why. And it's like, and frankly, a lot of stuff that happens in life, like there's no answer to that question. And he said, and the real question is, what now? What am I supposed to do with what I've been dealt? And I think what post-traumatic growth provides is permission to struggle and the opportunity to grow with the struggle, through the struggle, in the struggle. And I think that's what and that's where you talk about hope. And to me, hope is the belief that how things are isn't how they have to be. And I think without it, life is bleak and dark, and it contributes to some of the epidemics that we have in our communities we love and care about, and in the broader world. And I think it's like Rich said, it's not easy. It's hard work, but it's worth doing, because the alternative is inconceivable, right? Which is just ceasing to live and just simply existing. And everyone deserves better than that.
And I guess I'm just thinking as you're saying that, Josh, that another thing that's important, I'm not sure how much is a misconception, but what's also important is to realize that this kind of journey that we're on, paradox again, is something that we have to do the work to get through. But at the same time, it's very helpful when we find someone to accompany us on this journey. So nobody can do it for us and tell us how to do this and what to believe and all of that. But we can't just do it by ourselves very easily either. And it's best when we are linked with someone who can understand our situation and what we've been through, and is a good listener and can join up with us through this. That's not to say that people can't do this by themselves primarily, because I think there are stories of that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
People in very lonely circumstances who can pull themselves through this. But it's best when we find a companion through this. So that's another thing that's kind of paradoxical, I think.
Yeah.
It's a lonely journey in some ways, essentially, existentially lonely.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, when we're connected with other people, it's something that's providing this kind of support, scaffolding, all this. It makes it something that we can do much, much more effectively with that support.
I remember this guy said, I have to do it on my own, but I can't do it by myself.
Mm.
And it's like the
That's
perfect quote.
There you go.
And frankly,
That's better said than what I.
Where were you when they were coming up with post-traumatic growth? You
There
could
you
have
go.
saved them
Hey,
8 years.
Yeah.
I think that's true, but I don't know if I would have got. I mean, I might have come up with something else more convoluted.
Something worse.
But I think, this is where I think like literature and books and the world we live in, like Viktor Frankl was a companion when I was doing this. It's like close my eyes and think. But it's interesting how the people who join you on the path aren't always people who are physically in your orbit, but it's just the sense that you're not the first person to ever walk this path. And I think there's a great opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just today reading a text from a person I work with who's just discovered that her daughter has cancer and is in a pretty serious situation. And so I messaged her and asked, how you doing? What's going on? And she said, we're at the hospital and all that, and we're going through this. And she said, we've got some of our friends and family are helpful, but she also says, and we've met some other helpers along the way.
Aww.
And that's what happens. People meet these helpers that they don't anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're an open kind of person, you allow that to enter your life, that kind of help. But you gotta be open to it.
It's like my version of the group of bereaved parents that Rich went to this group for 25 years is this sense that they would say, I wish I never knew you, but I couldn't imagine my life without you.
Yeah.
And there's something so beautiful because obviously they wish their child was healthy and growing up, but like they had found these people who they never would have been connected with if not for this awful loss.
Mm.
And so I think it's just, they're all paradoxes, right? That's what this whole thing is about. And I think that, opening people up, especially when we're struggling and we're closed-minded and we're not, it's like, how do you provide some cognitive flexibility to realize that, like, as our dear friend Miriam likes to say, like, two things can be true at the same time.
I love saying that. I'm going to copy her.
There you
Yes. Well, I want to say, too, as somebody who's new to this, that I appreciate how clear you're both being on the fact that you are still going to struggle. Because I think that's a feeling, too, when you're new to it. Feels like, I need to just get over this faster. I need to get to the growth part faster. And I don't want to burden people with my woes or my traumas. And I think this is a very random reference, and I'm saying it to one of the most quotable people I know, which is you. But it was from Billy Bob Thornton, and he lost his brother when they were teens, I think. And he said, ever since my brother died, there's a melancholy in me that will never go away. And my grandpa was a foundational figure for me, raised me really in many ways. And when he died, he was 92, and everybody was like, oh, wow, like what a beautiful life. And I almost felt like, oh, I'm not allowed to mourn him because he was old and it was his time and he lived this beautiful life. And that was true. Two things can be true. He did. And I missed my grandpa. And so I feel that I still kind of have this melancholy about when you've loved someone so greatly and then you lose them. There's like this part of me that will always have this desire for my grandpa to be here.
Right.
But I think that's important. It doesn't mean I've lived a diminished life or that I won't be able to live a beautiful life without my grandpa. But I think it's a realistic thing that like I'm always going to have this little bit of me that says like, oh, like I wish he was here for that.
To me, it's like tenderizer.
Yeah.
These things are tenderizers, and they're unfortunate in themselves, but they have that effect of allowing us to be more tender people.
When I think about the helper idea and what you just shared, because my grandma was 102, and she died suddenly, like at 102. I was with her 2 weeks before, and then 2 weeks later, my dad visited. He called me, he's like, "Your grandma's not making it the week." I'm like, I was literally just with her. We were planning to see each other again, and the rabbi was amazing, and he looked at it was my dad and my brother, and myself and my uncle. And he looked at my dad and my brother, and he's like, people are going to say things that feel really, really harsh and callous. They're going to say she lived a long life. She lived a good life. It was her time. And he goes, and I just want you to know. And he looked at my dad and his brother, and he said, you lost your mom. And he looked at my brother and I, and he said, you lost your grandma. And that's sad. And it doesn't matter how old she was. And it just was so meaningful, because what he gave us permission to do was to grieve, because we're expected to be like, she lived a great life, and so it's fine, but it's not. It's sad. And then I think the other piece is, and this goes to the belief thing, is like, what do you believe about your connection to that person? And I think, one time Rich and I were talking about his father, and he's like, the idea that he's not so deeply connected is ridiculous, right? And Viktor Frankl was asked about his wife, Ellie, who he married, and she was Catholic, he was Jewish. They got buried in separate cemeteries. And they said, does it worry you that you're going to be separated? And he goes, as if they could keep us apart, right? And so I feel like that process of reflecting on life and what you believe is like, I spent time, and I remember I was staring at my grandfather's grave, and I was calculating how long they had been apart, and they were married for 65 years. And I was like, you know what? It's time for him to get her back. And I don't have a religious context to operate from. I still, when my grandfather was dying, I was like trying to figure out what Jews believed about death, and I didn't find any answers. So I was like, all right, I'll just make it up. And I was like, okay, it's time. And then the other thing was that C.S. Lewis said about his wife, who he loved, he just said, the less I mourn her, the closer I am to her. And what he was speaking to is like, she was inextricably part of him, and her essence was inextinguishable. Like, there was no way that you could take that away. And so the more you connect to that, and less to the physical presence, which is still sad, right?
Yes.
And so I think it's all of those things that what PTG is about is like reflecting on all of that, and the nature of the loss, the proximity, all of those things change. But like, that's to me what this is about. It's getting people to reflect upon, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And how do you make sense of this in some way? And the richest point, you can't adopt somebody else's beliefs about what they think happened. You have to like in your soul believe it, because that's where you find some meaning and purpose and the capacity to honor that which you lost.
Yeah.
And the richest point, it sensitizes you to,
Yeah, and you can't let somebody else define your story or write your story for you. And that's what the rabbi was saying, I think. People are going to offer you this story, and he's saying, and you don't have to let them do that. You have your own feelings about this and your feelings about your grandmother, and that's yours. You just keep that. Yeah.
Those are beautiful sentiments. My grandparents were married 73 years, and my grandpa would say, we've only gotten in one fight, but it lasted 73 years. My grandma never laughed. I liked yours much better. Well, I do think, as we were saying, we have a lot more to cover, which I'm really excited about that and about learning more. But I do want to say, if there's anything that we talked about that you think people who are coming here in this first episode, they're kind of getting the baseline intro to PTG and post-traumatic growth, is there anything else that you think is important to know before we kind of get through the rest of the series, or do you think we'll uncover that kind of as we go?
I hope people think that what we've been talking about is interesting, and they'll pursue it, because I think it's, that's what's kept me going all these years doing this work. It remains interesting because we're talking about the amazing lives that people lead in some of the worst circumstances. And that's just a great story. And I hope people continue to follow this through and be maybe inspired by some of these stories.
Yeah. Well, you've led me into my last question for you, which was, you've been studying this for a long time. I was saying 1995, which I think is incorrect.
Well, that was when the first book came out.
Pinnacle moment when they
That's when they started with the name.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
so
only took 12
go
years,
back.
and then-
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but what excites you or motivates you to continue doing this work?
Well, I just love people's stories because people are amazing, and they're always different stories in some way or another. So there's that, and I feel like they teach me something about living my life well, keep me on track, and guide me into my own future this way.
I'm grateful to be doing this with both of you and to be able to dive in more. And thank you so much for taking us through kind of the basics of post-traumatic growth. As we continue moving on through the series, we're going to talk to researchers, other thought leaders, more of the team at the Boulder Crest Institute, and also inspiring people who have gone through their own struggles and have kind of been transformed by that. So I'm really looking forward to diving in more and just to continue these conversations, and learnings is really what it is. So thank you.
Thanks, Brett.
I look forward to it. Yep.
Yay.